Rankings are great, and we provide consensus rankings over at Football Guys, but tiered rankings are where you really get an idea of what parts of the draft board you should be attacking in your rookie drafts. And today, Jeff Bell and I, we combined our rankings to make a miniature consensus between the two of us, and we looked at those rankings and placed tiers inside of them, kind of letting you know the parts of the draft that you should be looking at. So, Jeff, no huge surprise here, but at 1 and 2, you and I had the same 1 and 2, Cam Ward and Ashton Jinty. That's tier one, right? Do you see any situation where another guy could crack that tier right now that we have with Cam Ward and Ashton Jinty?
I think you're looking at Omarion Hampton or Travion Henderson landing in an ideal play, like maybe like Dallas or something. If like Travion Henderson goes 11th overall to Dallas, I mean,
Yeah.
you probably could push him up there at that point. Or Shadur Sanders lands in an offense high enough with a lot of weapons where you feel really, really good about that landing spot would be probably the two ways that you might lean that direction towards potentially expanding that tier. It's but really realistically, you would need a lot on top of
Yeah.
Shadur Sanders to trade for Cam Ward or to get to Ashton Genty. So that's where it's tough to see that tier expanding too much. But like I said, somebody lands 11th overall to Dallas and is their starting running back, then that's going to start to think about expanding that.
And that's kind of where I'm at is like there's a lot of guys that I want to like put in a best case scenario sort of situation and I can get excited about, like Ted McMillan with Panthers. Like we'd love that, going top 10 in the draft, going to a team that has a need for an X receiver. But even if he gets that ideal landing spot and draft capital, I don't know if I'm willing to put him in the Ashton Jinty tier. Travis Hunter, he can go 2 overall to Cleveland, and we would love that draft capital. We'd love the path to a lot of targets there in Cleveland, but there's still the concern that he'd be playing heavy snaps at quarterback and how that could impact him at the NFL. So I'm kind of with you. I think, Travion Henderson, Omarion Hampton, I think those would be the two that could maybe move up there alongside Jinty. And this is something that we've talked about before, where if Jinty gets a less than ideal landing spot, let's say he goes to the Jets, and we've already heard Aaron Glenn really wants to have this committee approach there in New York. That's not great. And then if Omarion Hampton, who visited with the Bears on Monday afternoon, if he goes there, and then we're looking at Jinty with the Jets and Omarion Hampton with the Bears, then we could probably move Hampton inside that tier. So that's kind of where I'm at. I think the running backs are the ones that have the ability to move up, but I don't see anybody else besides Cam Ward or Ashton Jinty moving inside there, unless, of course, I don't know. Is there a possibility? Are we at the point where Tennessee has just been smoke screening us for the last 3 months, and maybe they make a trade? No, they're going Cam Ward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to say, I know we talked a couple weeks ago about Cam Ward, Ashton Genty. I thought it was interesting. I checked out Keep Trade Cut, and in my dynasty brain, the way that everything kind of ran last offseason, when you were looking at Superflex, people were running 10 quarterbacks off the board to start a draft.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Keep Trade Cut right now, it's a lot more mix of position players and quarterbacks at the top of the draft, as opposed to the way that we saw for a while where Jamar Chase might be the first position player off the board at the 109. Now he's the 103. And so I don't know if the Ashton Genty definitely above Cam Ward consensus plays into that at all, or is because of that at all. But I do think that that's an interesting shift in the Superflex landscape.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm looking right now on Keep Trade Cut. Ashton Jinty and Amari and Hampton are both ranked ahead of Cam Ward. So we are kind of on this island out here, Jeff. And, I did a show with Alfredo Brown yesterday where we kind of talked through the first round of dynasty drafts. And Alfredo's also there, where he's got Cam Ward ahead of Jinty as well for a lot of the reasons that we've discussed on this show. We won't go into it again. We've talked about this plenty of times on the show, but just the stability, the insulation that you get with a quarterback that you don't get with a running back. I'm firmly in the Cam Ward ahead of Jinty camp, but Keep Trade Cut right now is Ashton Jinty in a tier of his own, and then Omari and Hampton ahead of Cam Ward after that. Kind of shocked to see that, but we do this over at Football Guys. We try not to let the consensus seep too heavily into our analysis. But let's move down into tier 2. And in this tier, I've got 5 players here, and one of them is going to be heavily dependent on landing spot and draft capital. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in tier 2, we've got Omarion Hampton, Travion Henderson, Travis Hunter, Shador Sanders, and Tet McMillan. Now, Shador Sanders is the one that really sticks out to me here. Again, I'll talk about the show that I did with Alfredo yesterday, we kind of talked about that. I said there's a big tier fall off after 106 or after 107 if you think Shador Sanders gets a good landing spot in draft capital. We're hearing reports that some teams don't even have a first round grade on Shador Sanders. We're also hearing that the New York Giants are hosting him for a private workout, which could indicate that they want to take him third overall. We're hearing that the Steelers might be interested at 21. Shador Sanders is a very polarizing player, of course. Where do you expect him to get drafted, and how much can he move up and down in your rankings based on that?
I've long felt like he feels either the Saints at 9 or the Steelers at 21 feels like the range in my mind of the two teams that stand out the most for taking Shedeur Sanders. I know there was a little bit of a nugget that I heard a week ago or so where Deion Sanders kind of dropped the how the Saints colors are the same as Colorado's colors, and
Yeah.
Shedeur Sanders looks good in gold and black. So what's also the Steelers colors, but um, that those two landing spots feel like the most likely for me. Or maybe it is the case that he's always been a giant, and that's why teams have just not really worried too much about it. Because I do feel like we do hear about that where I remember CJ Stroud is falling down the board,
Yeah.
and then the Houston Texans got on the clock at 102, took CJ Stroud, and we're basically like, we've made this pick like 60 plus days ago, basically. And so I think that that's definitely in play for Sanders, and we're definitely reaching the window where all of a sudden Will Levis is going to go second in the draft, and CJ Stroud might fall out of the top 10, and then it turns out to be
Malik
like,
Willis,
no,
number one overall.
yeah, like no, it was always this way.
Yeah, and I think something that I can't help ignore is how Dion has kind of changed his tune a little bit. You talk about him saying like, "Oh yeah, he'd look good in gold and black," and it seemed like not that long ago. You go 4 or 5 months ago, Deion Sanders was, we're only going to play where we want to play. We're going to choose where he wants to go, and now it's, hey, any team that wants to draft Shador, he's more than happy to play there. He'd look good in Vegas. He'd look good in Los Angeles. He'd look good in Las Vegas and New Orleans. It seems like now they're much more open to these possibilities, which maybe does give some credence into the storyline that he's falling a little bit because a lot of that overconfidence and bravado that was surrounding Shador Sanders and the things coming out of Dion's mouth from a few months ago don't seem to be quite as boisterous anymore.
Yeah, and maybe they just didn't want to go to Cleveland. So
Which, yeah, can't blame them for that. So, anybody else you want to talk about in this tier, Jeff? We kind of talked about this tier when we were talking about tier one. Hampton and Henderson could definitely move up into tier one with ideal landing spots. Travis Hunter, there's always going to be that little bit of concern. Is he going to play cornerback enough that it's going to negatively impact his wide receiver? I think that's always going to be in the back of the mind. Shador Sanders, we talked about him. Ted McMillan, I think, is right now for us in tier two, but let's just talk about that a little bit because we have heard that this is a pretty flat wide receiver class. And it wouldn't shock me if this year looks a lot like last year, where we see all of these receivers kind of clustered together, late first, early second round picks. So, how far would Ted McMillan have to fall in the draft for him to move out of this tier and down into the next tier where we've got quite a few other receivers?
I mean, probably second round or so, or land in a potentially bad spot because you start to talk about these players falling down the board, and it gets more interesting for a player like McMillan because you like put him in
Whether you fall, the better the landing
Washington
spot.
or Buffalo or something like that, and like okay, he's playing with Josh Allen now instead of being at a bad passing offense with a bad quarterback. So there's always like this little bit of sliding scale where in you see somebody falling down the draft and you instinctively think, well, we thought he was going to be a top 10 pick, but he's not anymore. But then he lands and he is Josh Allen's number one wide receiver. And you're like, oh, okay, let's go. Like
Yeah.
and so I think that's always
It's
in
like,
play.
oh
I think
crap, he doesn't get to play with Derek Carr. Like,
yes,
no, he's got to go
exactly.
play with Jaden Daniels. What a shame.
Yes. And so I feel like that for in terms of landing spot, that's always in play in fantasy. It's that when it's I feel like the early second is where you're kind of like the trouble spot because you missed all the good landing spots and then you're back to the bad teams, but also you didn't go in the first round. And so you're kind of doubling up on those types of things.
But also, what we saw last year was a lot of movement in that area where teams were moving up a couple picks, moving down a couple picks to get the guys they wanted, and it just kind of happened last year that all of those receivers we talked about, I think the one that didn't have an ideal landing spot was Xavier Legette. But you look, Ricky Pearsall, we knew it was going to kind of be year one was going to be tough, but we knew that opportunity was going to open up soon. Keon Coleman gets the opportunity to play with Patrick Mahomes. Xavier Worthy gets to play with Patrick Mahomes. Keon Coleman gets to play with Josh Allen, and Lad McConkey gets to play with Justin Herbert. So, like I said, kind of worked out well for all of those guys last year, and we could see something similar this year. Let's move on to tier 3 now. And this is where we had quite a few differences in rankings, but we're not going to focus on those too much. We're going to focus more on the tier here because I think we do agree mostly that this is a tier. So after the top 7 from 108 down to what is that, 203, I believe, we've got Tyler Warren, Quinshon Judkins, Luther Burden, Emeka Egbuka, Colston Loveland, and Matthew Golden. Jeff, let's kind of talk about this tier the same way we've talked about some of these other tiers. First question I have, though, is who do you think from this tier has the most to lose and the most to gain in this draft? Do you see anybody that could jump up or fall down multiple tiers next Thursday or Friday?
What's going on with Luther Burden? Because you're seeing him outside of the first round in mock drafts. There's concerns about hand size. There's concerns about usage. Feels like the one that if he starts to slide into day 2, like that could be, especially where he was. You think about where he was 2 months ago or so, and some people had him as their wide receiver 1 in the class. And again, now it feels like he probably won't go in the first round of the draft. And where does he end up? So that's an interesting spot there. And then maybe by the same token, Matthew Golden with some of the stuff that's coming out lately about like, oh, did he actually run the speed that he supposedly ran, and production profile, those types of things. It's just a lot of up in the air with these wide receivers because we continually hear about how down the wide receivers are in the class. And I think that there's some level of when you're doing a mock draft and those types of things, thinking about the value of wide receiver and thinking you got to put wide receivers up here. If those two players fall out, and I mean, if they fall into that early second territory where they landed a team that doesn't have a good quarterback, I mean, those two to me stand out as players that could potentially fall down.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about Matthew Golden, his trajectory feels very similar to Xavier Worthy last year, right? Like pre-combine, getting a little bit of buzz. Everybody kind of had him inside the top 10, but nobody was crazy about him. And then smokes the combine, and then everybody's talking about him. Oh, this is going to be a top 10 pick. Maybe he's a top 15 pick. Maybe he's a top 20 pick. Maybe he's a round 2 pick. And it seems like now that gleam that he got from his combine performance is starting to wear off a little bit. And I think that would make sense where he can kind of fall into that same cluster that I'm talking about, kind of near that 1-2 turn. Burton is another interesting guy. I mean, like, this was the guy during the NCAA season everybody was talking about. And immediately after it was, is it Ted McMillan or is it Luther Burden? It seems like the fantasy community really liked Luther Burden because of the production, but it doesn't seem like the NFL scouts and evaluators have that same sort of love for him. But with these players, say this all the time, you don't need 32 teams to love them. You only need one. And if there's one team sitting there in the 20s that says they really like Luther Burden and they make that pick, it doesn't matter what the rest of the NFL thinks because that one team went out and got him. And that's kind of what we're hoping for there. Tyler Warren is a guy that I am a little bit lower on than you. I've got him at 11. You've got him at 8. Both very similar, though. We have him kind of projected as a late first round pick. He's a guy I could see moving up quite a bit, though. I mean, if he ends up going off the board before any of the wide receivers, which looks realistic that he could get drafted before Ted McMillan and Matthew Golden and anybody else we've talked about, if he goes first in the NFL draft, is it crazy to think about drafting him before the wide receivers in your rookie drafts, too?
No, I don't think it's crazy at all. And especially you look at him as a guy that could potentially go top 10 in the draft. And I know that tight ends that go in the first round never work out is where people are currently saying, even though Brock Bowers just broke every single record imaginable to tight ends. But that's where, yeah, you're looking at him being a top 10 pick. And especially if he lands at a good landing spot as a top 10 pick, then you're putting him up there. And if these other wide receivers slip down, that creates those questions again about those players and creates that opportunity. I mean, Warren is the type of player you saw him at Penn State, the different types of usage that they were able to get out of him, and Wildcat quarterback. I mean, all kinds of different things, lining him up out wide, lining him up in line. So that bringing that into play, landing with a great landing spot. Absolutely.
And then Colson Loveland, I had long been holding the torch for Terrence Ferguson as my tight end too. I finally caved and I moved Colson Loveland ahead of Terrence Ferguson. I've still got him as my tight end 3, but the smoke that we've been hitting about Colson Loveland, I forget who. It was either Daniel Jeremiah or Dane Brugler. Somebody tweeted on Monday that both Tyler Warren and Colson Loveland are top 10 talents, and that it seems like a lot of people are forgetting about Loveland because of the smoke that Tyler Warren's been getting. So that's another one right now that I'm probably a little bit too low on. Like I said, I moved him up to tight end 2, but I've still got him going in the early second. But he's another one of these guys. If they're talking about him as a potential top 10 talent, if he goes top 10, if he goes top 15, you can't really ignore that. I almost wonder if both of us, having Warren and Loveland kind of in that late first, early second range, if we might both be a little bit too low on him, if that's the draft capital they're going to be pulling.
I mean, I've got Warren at 8 and Loveland at 9, so I don't feel like I'm too low on those players. I'm kind of priced them in to be in that top 20 range. And so I'm comfortable there. But yeah, I mean, I could, again, see the scenario where you might move McMillan down. Travis Hunter is the one that I feel like he's risen so much now, and you're locking him in to a
Yeah.
top 2 or top 3 pick, and to take him there, I think the biggest argument on Travis Hunter, one, you need to look at the value of wide receiver relative to the value of quarterback in the league, and if he goes
Mhm.
second overall in the draft, they are going to feature him on offense,
Yep.
and so that eliminates a lot of the. We had the talk a month or so more ago about him being at the back end of the first round, but the potential to be the biggest riser out of that, to
And it's
go
happened.
second overall. Yeah, they're going to use him heavily on offense. Those questions were probably a little bit extreme.
Sorry for the multiple questions about Tyler Warren and Colson Loveland. It kind of dawned on me that I'm probably just still coping over the fact that I had Roma Dunze ahead of Brock Bowers in my rankings last year and had to make that choice in multiple rookie drafts and still regret it just a little bit. All right. One last guy I want to talk about in this tier, though, Jeff, and that's Quinshon Judkins. You and I are both pretty high on Quinshon Judkins. I've got him at the 109. You've got him at the 110. Now, I think my fear with Quinshon Judkins, and maybe again, this is just me talking about um, possibilities here just to kind of protect myself for inevitable disappointment, as I often do, is I don't think we're going to see any of these top running backs slide in the draft. When we're talking about Ashton Jinty, Travion Henderson, Omarion Hampton, I think they're pretty secure where they are. But I think what we could see is this next tier of running backs, which would include Quinshon Judkins and Caleb Johnson and Cam Scattaboo and RJ Harvey and some other guys that are drawing buzz right now. Do you think that's maybe where we see NFL teams wait? Because nobody wants to be at the start of a run. Everyone wants to be at the back of that run. So do you think that teams might be hesitant to draft Quinshon Judkins, saying, why would I pay up for Quinshon Judkins now when I could let another team draft Judkins and then I could just get Caleb Johnson or Cam Scattaboo later? Do you think that the depth of this class could end up pushing Judkins down further than we'd expect?
Well, one, I think Judkins is clearly ahead of that tier. I don't put him with the tier of those guys. I think that he's, in my opinion, he's clearly above that. But um, I think it's important to note that the Eagles won the Super Bowl with Saquon Barkley, whereas if the Chiefs had won the Super Bowl with no running back that you could name, then running backs would not be very valuable. But because the Eagles won the Super Bowl with Saquon, running backs are extremely valuable now again in the league. And so that is probably driving Travion Henderson, Omarion Hampton, and Genty potentially into the top half of the first round, maybe. And so if those players go there, again, you're looking at those back half of the first round landing spots that if Quinshon Judkins is a Chief or something like that, you're pretty excited about that.
Let's move on to the next tier now. So at this point, we're kind of getting into the early middle of the second half. And typically, what we see with tiers is the tiers get bigger the deeper we get. But this one does get a little bit smaller. We've got a mini tier here in the middle of round 2. Caleb Johnson, Trey Harris, Jalen Milrow, and Jalen Knoll. Jeff, I'll totally take the blame here. My ranking on Trey Harris is dragging him into this tier. I've got him at the 112. You've got him at 207. So a little bit of a disparity there, but still nothing huge. But in this tier, Caleb Johnson, Trey Harris, Jalen Milrow, and Jalen Knoll. We'll ask the same question we've been asking, and I think I know the answer here. But is there a guy you could see really shooting up or down into a different tier after the draft?
I mean, certainly Milrow. There's
Yep.
just so much unknown about. Obviously, he's getting invited to the draft, but so much unknown about him that if he is a first round pick, you're looking at that potential explosion, athleticism out of the quarterback position, that deep arm, if he's like with the Steelers, would be amazing with those wide receivers. That's where, yeah, if he gets that first round draft capital, you're taking him in the first round of your Superflex drafts, I would have to imagine. And if he doesn't, if he slips down a little bit and he's a later day 3 pick, then you're looking at like the 301 type area, the late second type
Maybe
area.
even later than that. Yeah. Day three quarterbacks. We remember the Brock Purdy's and we don't remember the hundreds of other guys that aren't Brock Purdy. So,
He's
yeah,
not going day 3. There's no way
I
he's
don't think so.
inviting him to the draft and
You
he's gonna
said day
sit
three.
there
That's
for.
why I asked, Jeff.
No, I meant the 30. I said the 301,
Oh, all right. All right. All right.
as in
I
like
thought
the
you said day
rookie
three.
301, which
Yeah.
is where we usually kind of see those guys that. I mean, Will Levis went higher there, but I'm thinking back to like Davis Mills was kind of like that 301 range, or like Kellen Mond, like those types of players, which I were probably day 3 picks. That so yeah, maybe I did say that by accident.
Malik Willis almost made it to day three. They caught him in round three before he officially made it there. But we'll hope Jalen Milrow has a better opportunity here, and he's still a guy that I'm expecting to go inside the first round. And I think both of our rankings kind of say that. We'll get to Jackson Dart in the next year, but we have a pretty big gap between Jalen Milrow and Jackson Dart. Both of us preferring Milrow by quite a bit. Now, Jalen Knoll and Trey Harris are two receivers that kind of snuck in here. We're pretty tight on Jalen Knoll. We've got a little bit of a bigger gap on Trey Harris, but I am the one a little bit higher on both of these guys. And because of that, it's pulling their rankings up a little bit. So talk to me about both these guys, Jeff. Trey Harris and Jalen Knoll. They've been the two darlings of this prospect season for me. When I watch the wide receivers, or the guys that I see myself noticeably higher than consensus on. Throw some cool water on me because I might need to hear it about these two guys.
It's just again the unknown and how far wide receivers can fall if they fall into the draft, and you don't know landing spot. Are they going to be in a good passing attack? Are they a priority? If Trey Harris is a third round pick, is he a priority in that passing attack? There's that's the uncertainty of those types of players. Whereas there's definitely uncertainty with the running backs, but you think that there's going to be more quick path to success and involvement for those running backs versus those wide receivers that are, unless you're Amon-Ra St. Brown landing in the fourth round when the Lions had no wide receivers at all, just questions about what those roles might be if those players do not catch higher draft capital like we're hoping.
And here we are, we've talked about the depth of this running back class quite a bit. And in tier one, we've got Ginty. In tier two, we've got Hampton and Henderson. In tier three, we've got Judkins. And here we are in tier four, talking about Caleb Johnson, a guy who is still drawing round two buzz and could end up being an early day two pick. So just a testament to how good and deep this running back class is. Now let's move on to the next tier here, Jeff. And this is a much bigger tier. So bear with me as I go ahead and rattle off all these names. We've got Mason Taylor, Kyle Williams, RJ Harvey, Damian Martinez, Cam Scadaboo, Jackson Dart, Alec Ayo Terrence Ferguson, Harold Fannin, Dylan Sampson, LaQuint Allen, Elijah Arroyo, and Jaden Higgins. So this is a big tier here, but we're really splitting hairs here. And I think what this tier means, which is kind of the middle of round two through the middle of round three, is basically, hey, we're going to let the draft capital do the work for us in this tier, right? Is that kind of how you're looking at this one, Jeff?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what you're dealing with. And again, Mason Taylor's a player that I think has a great chance to maybe go in the first round. And so that's why I've got him at the top of this tier. There's been little percolating rumors about obviously Cam Ward and Kyle Williams playing together in the past, and the Titans sitting there at the 201. I mean, if Kyle Williams goes at the 201, pairs with Cam Ward, and potentially steps right away into, well, outside of Calvin Ridley being the lead receiver for the Titans, I mean, that's springing him up. The uncertainty with all these running backs. Are they going to be round two, day two running backs, or are they going to be lasting more into day three and land as backups? And yeah, the questions abound here.
Now, Jeff, you might know, and I'm looking for it real quickly. I saw a tweet a few days ago in regards to Kyle Williams. There's somebody that was on Washington State's staff last year that is now on the Titans. Are you familiar with that connection? I saw a tweet about this, and I'm looking for it, and I can't find it right now.
No, I did see the connection between Kyle Williams and Cam Ward playing together at Washington State, but I didn't realize there
Sorry,
was
it
a
wasn't
coaching
Washington
connection
State.
there
I
too.
got it. It's Nick Holtz was the offensive coordinator at or hold on. Kyle Williams played with Cam Ward at Washington State and previously played under Titans offensive coordinator Nick Holtz at UNLV. So that's what it is. There's multiple connections there with both the quarterback, the wide receiver, and the offensive coordinator.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And you think about again when Joe Burrow was drafted, and they turn around and take T. Higgins right away at the beginning of the second round, and they didn't know each other. They'd never talked to each other before those draft picks occurred. But I mean, that certainly worked out when they were on the same team.
So what do you make of this? Because Kyle Williams is a guy that you liked a lot, and I've said multiple times on this show, you kind of turned me on to Kyle Williams back in, I want to say, January or February. And at that time, I mean, he wasn't even in sleeper when I was inputting my rookie rankings into Fantasy Pros. They didn't even have him ranked as a prospect. I mean, this was a guy like outside of the top 30, 40 wide receivers in consensus rankings. You were very high on him. Then Chris Sims came out and ranked him as his wide receiver 3. And now you look, you see these top 30 visits. I want to say Kyle Williams has met with 10 or 12 teams already. It seems like all of these teams are bringing Kyle Williams in. What do you make of that? I mean, is this a guy who's going to be going in round 2, or is this kind of teams feeling out saying, hey, is this a guy we want to spend a day 3 pick on?
Well, look at the profile, and he is the type of, when you're looking at wide receiver profiles, you get like Trey Harris, I feel like is pretty pigeonholed into the direction that he might end up going within an NFL offense.
Mhm.
Whereas Kyle Williams, the quick game that he's able to contribute in is big for NFL passing attacks right now. I think there's versatility that you can move him into the slot, you can move him outside, he can attack vertically. It's how many boxes can you check? And when you're dealing with some of these more limited wide receivers that you are seeing, well, he's a 9 route guy, and that's about where we've got him. Kyle Williams is the type of player that can handle volume at the NFL level in a passing attack, and you can slide him in regardless of what type of wide receiver you need to complement your wide receiver core.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to talk about this tier too much, Jeff, because as we said, this is the tier that we are going to kind of let draft capital do the work for us. I mean, we have done a lot of shows about a lot of different rookies. We've talked about our favorite sleepers. We've talked about risers and fallers. We've talked about good team landing spots and all that sort of stuff. And we're at the point now where the draft is, next week, next Thursday, we're going to finally find out where these guys go. So I don't want to beat a dead horse and just talk about these guys that we've talked about over and over again. The focus of today's show was kind of talking about these different tiers. So let's go through this one more time and try to put some actionable spins on this. So we talk about this top tier, 1 and 2, kind of being in a tier of its own. You get neither Cam Ward or Ashton Jinty. So if you've got the 103 and you want to trade up for a top 2 pick, Jeff, how much are you willing to trade up to move into, like from 103 to 102 or from 103 to 101? Because I have seen some trades going around on Twitter that are ludicrous, where our friend Rocky over at Dynasty Trade Addicts, I don't know if you saw the trade that he shared today. He offered the 103, a future first and a future second to move up to 101, and it got rejected. So, I mean, that's how much people are holding on to this 101 right now, is that they aren't going to, take on a future first to move back 2 picks.
Yeah, and I think that time has shown that how many situations is that actually the right move? Like how many like you think about a couple years ago, 2 years ago, when Bijan Robinson was like, you have to take him number
I got a
one, and
story about
then
that draft.
Jameer Jameer Gibbs is like the 106, and you're kind of like, well, I mean, and now had you taken a haul to move off of Bijan Robinson and grab Jameer Gibbs, looks pretty good right
You want to
now.
know the haul that I got for the 101 a few years ago? You want to hear this one, Jeff?
Of course, I always do.
I traded from the 101 to the 103. So I moved back 2 spots. And in return, I got Drake London and a 3rd round pick. So I used that 103 to draft CJ Stroud. I got Drake London, and then I used my 3rd round pick on Devon Achane. So I flipped Bijan Robinson into CJ Stroud, Drake London, and Devon Achane. Yeah, I mean, if you can do that with the 101 and you're sitting there hoping to draft Ashton Jinty, but you could trade back to the 103, get a proven young wide receiver and a 3rd round pick on top of that, I'm not thinking twice about that. Are you?
No, not at all. Knowing that, I mean, you have to get Devon Achane in the 3rd round, and so
Right.
yeah,
Even
I mean, if
without
I'm
Devon
getting Devon
Achane, though.
Achane with every single 3rd round pick I have, like I'm just gonna get all the 3rd round picks. Like that's fine. But
I mean, I did
it's
luck out on that one a little bit, but
yeah.
that's what I'm saying. I mean, the Drake London I think was the big one there, but then also hitting on CJ Stroud at 103. And who's to say this year that you could end up with a 103 from 101? You might not be getting Ashton Jinty, but you could still get Cam Ward, who could have a similar season to CJ Stroud. And if you get a young proven, I'm trying to think of like 2 years out now, who would be like a good example for a Drake London, maybe a Roma Dunze. Is that something you do, Jeff? Move from 101 to 103 and take Roma Dunze in a third round pick. Would that be enough to get it done?
101 to 103 for Roma Dunze and a third round pick.
Yeah. So moving
Mm,
back 2 spots for Roma in a third.
I maybe would want a second, probably.
All right.
But
Fair enough.
let's look at running back scoring, though. And I want to bring this up. And I wish that things were moving a little bit quicker here because we're trying to make content. But okay. So Saquon
So
Barkley, running back
what
one
happens when
last
we don't
year.
prep before shows and we just let it rip as we're recording?
Well, Saquon Barkley, running back one last year at
Yeah.
21.1 points per game.
Mhm.
Jameer Gibbs at running back two at 19.8. And your Bijan Robinson at running back four, 18.3. So you're talking about, okay, between Saquon and Jonathan Taylor, there was nearly a 5 point difference, but you're like 3 points per game or so, if that, probably maybe being realistic. And there's always the chance that Trayvon Henderson and Omarion Hampton are outscoring Ashton Genty in fantasy points.
Exactly. Especially like we talked about with some of these potential landing spots late in the first round. I've seen a lot of mocks where Omarion Hampton is landing in Kansas City. And I mean, you put Omarion Hampton in Kansas City, it's going to be really tough for him to outperform Ashton Jinty in any circumstance. So, yeah, I mean, I always think it's good practice to try to trade back. Of course, if you're trading out of one of these tiers, though, you're going to want something a little bit bigger. So let's talk about that
Yeah.
then, Jeff. If you're sitting down here at 107 and somebody wants you to trade back to 108, that's where we do talk about that potential tier fall off. You know, right now it looks like you could get Tet McMillan or Shador Sanders or Tyler Warren, but if Shador Sanders doesn't get the good draft capital, or if Travion Henderson and Omarion Hampton don't get the draft capital then we want, then all of a sudden that 107 isn't quite as, or that 108 isn't quite as nice as we had hoped for. So if you're sitting there with a 107 right now, then somebody wants to trade back or wants you to trade back into the 108, 19, 110, something like that. Is that something you're even entertaining? And if so, how much would you need on top to move back from 107?
Future firsts are always very interesting. So
Yes.
I'll say that future firsts
Many as you can get.
for me in Dynasty are very, very interesting, especially the excitement around the 2027 class when you're looking at having Ryan Williams and having, why don't I remember his name? Because he's plays for my favorite team, but the Ohio State wide receiver. Gosh, I just completely drew a blank. Um, but yeah, I think that last year you had people that tiered down from Rome Odunze to Brian Thomas Jr.
Mm-hmm.
or from Rome Odunze to Lad McConkey, and that worked pretty well. Or maybe you grabbed Bo Nix, or I think that I do believe that people are way too rigid on tiers when it comes to these rookie drafts, and especially when you're looking at kind of that second half, the back half of that first round, and especially that 107, and thinking that people get so militant about there are 7 players in this draft, and that is all that matters. There are 7 players in this draft. And then, like I said, last year you had Michael Penix and Bo Nix and Brian Thomas Jr. and Lad McConkey were not in the 7 or 8 players in the draft last year.
Exactly. So, I mean, we started off the show talking about the tiers because I think it's an important discussion to have. But as we have kind of talked about over the last few minutes here, overconfidence is something that seeps into a lot of analysis right now. And more often than not, as I said a few minutes ago, it is just good practice to try to trade down. So I understand right now some people are going to say that Ashton Jinty is a generational prospect. And I have talked about the positional insulation that you get from a guy like Cam Ward getting drafted number 1 overall. But my thing right now, if I can trade back anywhere I can, I'm trying to do that. I don't want to be too confident or overconfident, I should say, in any of my analysis right now. Like, yeah, I love RJ Harvey, and I've talked about that a lot, but I'm not going to be trading up in rookie drafts to try to get RJ Harvey because the reality is, if I just sit where I am, I'm just as likely to hit on one of those other guys that falls into round 2. Anything else you'd
And
like to talk about, Jeff, before we put a bow on this one?
Just rounding it back again, I do think that your story is illustrative. And the more I play Dynasty, the more I talk to people, the more you run into people that, well, I tiered down from Bijan Robinson and got Jameer Gibbs and got two other first, one turned into Brock Bowers, and I got
Yep.
this. You will hear about those things in Dynasty a lot more than you'll hear about, well, I traded three first for Ashton Denty and I won my league. Like, it's like, I don't know.
I think the guys that I am comfortable giving up the huge packages for are the safe young quarterbacks who we know are going to be good for years to come. Go out and get yourself Jaden Daniels or Drake May. I think the window is already closed to go out and get your Patrick Mahomeses and your Josh Allens, but those are the guys, a few years ago, I'd gladly trade away 3 first-round picks for Josh Allen because you know that you're getting a locked and loaded top 2 QB for the next half decade. But at this point, now Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes and all these guys, they're about to turn 30 years old. And you don't want to pay a king's ransom for them anymore. So maybe now you turn your sights, and maybe the guys you want to start drafting are, like I said, Drake May, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, some of these guys that are young, have a lot of youth in front of them still, and can still be productive for years to come. But I don't think it's good practice. How many people do you know, Jeff, that just traded away the farm to get Marvin Harrison Jr. last year? That saw him, they were in the middle of their draft, Marvin Harrison Jr. is on the board, and they said, I need to move up to get him.
I mean, the tier was much too high, Dave. You got stuck with Malik Neighbors, and you had to live with it because tiering up to Marvin Harrison Jr. required way too much.
Yeah, kicking yourself because you couldn't get Brock Bowers, and then you were stuck with Brian Thomas Jr. Yeah, and here we are talking about these tiers and how we feel about them. But the reality is, if you're sitting there in your draft and you are, you know, livid that you weren't able to get Quinshawn Judkins, you know, maybe Luther Burden falls into your lap and becomes the next Jamar Chase. Who knows? Don't be too overconfident about any of this. I want to thank y'all for tuning in. Just a reminder, Jeff and I are going to be coming out with episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. So subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow along with the podcast, leave a review, leave a comment, give us a thumbs up, whatever you can do to help grow the show. We really appreciate it. We will be back on Thursday. We're going to talk about some risers and fallers throughout the entire offseason, whether it be combine related or news or rumors, whatever it may be, guys who have risen and fallen throughout the draft process. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you on Thursday.